Ortigosa, la aprieta Arevalo Ríos que le gana la pelota. Forlán para el segundo de Uruguay al marco. ¡Gol! De Uruguay. Diego Forlán que recibe el pase de Arevalo Ríos que robaba a mitad de cancha del equipo paraguayo y esta vez no perdonó y salió de la fase mala. Freddy, golazo de Forlán para el 2-0 de Uruguay que está ganando al minuto 41. Arriba sobre Paraguay 2.
Hello again, and welcome back to the 6th episode of the Football Talent Show. Joining me as always is Jacek Kulig to profile another country, and this time around we have a really special episode on Uruguay.
Hi Adam, great to be here again. Today we will talk about the famous Garra Charrúa, so Uruguay, a small country, but country with people with an enormous passion for the game.
I think that was one of the most fascinating aspects when we considered this country originally. Such a small country, less than 4 million people, but have such a history in football, hosting the first World Cup, winning the first World Cup, and generally overperforming for over a century in football. It's just such a fantastic nation that continues to produce talent, to have a national team that can compete at the highest level, and who has played such a huge role in South American and global football.
Yes, this is amazing to see a country like that produces players such as Luis Suarez, Diego Forlán, or Fede Valverde, for example. So it's a real talent factory. And when you look at the size of the population, it's mental. It's mental to see so many greats in football coming from Uruguay.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Jacek. And to unpack all of that on today's episode, we have a special guest as always. This time around, we're joined by David. He's from Amsterdam, but an absolute expert on the Uruguayan game. So, David, how are we doing today?
Hi, man. I'm very good. Thanks for having me.
Of course, most will know you from your Twitter handle, Warriors of Uruguay, over there on X, I guess it is nowadays. You have 22.8 thousand followers, so the biggest voice for Uruguayan football. David, what brought you into Uruguayan football? Because as people will hear for the remainder of the show, you don't have a typical Uruguayan accent. You're actually from Holland, so it's quite an interesting mix.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I don't have any Uruguayan blood, so I'm from Holland, and Suarez played there when he was like 19, 18, when he went to Groningen, and after a year he signed for Ajax. And back then, at the age of like 9, 10, 11, I was a big Ajax fan, and I was quite fascinated by him. He is so passionate. He is so unorthodox. He's cheeky. He's mischievous. I mean, he's mischievous. I'm trying to say. So he's like so different to what you expect in the Netherlands and what you brought up on, and that's why I was really a big fan of his. And when I got a bit older, like 16, 17, and you broaden your horizon outside of the Netherlands or your local environment, I tried to look into Uruguay as a country and saw obviously how great they had done in the history when it comes to football, and tried to learn about their culture, the footballing culture. And I got really fascinated by it, and I thought, why don't I start something with this online? I always was on Twitter, and I like to make content, create something. And I saw there was not really anything in English, not a lot anyway. So that's why I started, yeah.
That's in general a quite big problem in South America. People unable to speak English, which is really sad because they have a huge knowledge about football, and many times I would love to speak with them about football, but they are unable to speak English, and my Spanish is very far from being perfect. The funny thing, I spoke to an Ajax fan last year, and of course he was fed up with Ajax being that bad last season. And he told me a funny thing. He told me, "I'm fed up with all these Scandinavian talents. They do not have cojones. I would really love to have many more Argentinians and Uruguayans with their Grinta." Of course, like Ajax fans will not forget about Luis Suarez or Nicolas Tagliafico or Sandro Martinez for many years. So, yeah, Luis Suarez was such a special talent, and I think we will talk about him in a few minutes.
Yeah, especially with these South American players, I think the cojones aspect you see also for Uruguay. So many of these players who are decent players at club level, but when they put on that national team jersey, they're just a completely different player. Like someone like Martin Cáceres. I mean, he had a good career, but also not an incredible career. And then for the national team, he routinely looks like one of the top center backs in world football, or even in Latin America. I think the best example is always Memo Ochoa. Right, Memo Ochoa every 4 years turns into one of the best goalkeepers in the world when he's playing for Mexico. So there's really this real spirit for the national team that I think is unrivaled in Latin and South America.
If you look at Uruguayan players in the 21st century, I think that the word solidity, consistency is the key word. Like there were not many magicians out of Uruguay, like Brazilian magicians with a lot of creativity and flair, but most of these players were extremely solid. So if you just look at the team from 2010 that went to the semifinal of the World Cup, just look at this team: Lugano, Diego Godin, extremely solid defenders. In midfield, no magicians: Diego Perez, Walter Gargano, and Arevalo Rios. So yeah, if you go to shop in Uruguay, actually, when you are a European team, you either get a striker or a great center back or extremely solid and consistent midfielders. Like today, we see, for example, Manuel Ugarte.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree. Certainly in the last 20 years, there has not been really a place in the Uruguay national team for expensive wingers or number 10s who really try to create but are not that physical and don't work that hard. Under Tavares, there certainly wasn't. Under Bielsa, there's more room for it now. But Uruguay, in general, doesn't create these players that much. And also because when you are brought up in Uruguay, when you go through the ranks, hard, I guess, to have these players, these type of players, flourish.
Yeah, I can't wait to get into all these topics throughout the next 2 hours and more, because I know how long these podcasts can get when we're talking about a topic that we all hold so dearly to our heart. But Jacek, before we move on, I want to also get your first Uruguay memory.
As usual, I am the oldest one here. So my first memory comes to the 90s. And actually, I was a center back during my youth. Not a very elegant center back. I'm going to say that I was a very, very no-nonsense center back. So one of my first idols was Paulo Montero. Paulo Montero, who was one of the greatest, probably pure defenders in the 90s. And he was a member on one of the most solid center back lines in the history of football, let's be honest. Juventus with Marculian, with Pesotto, with Ferrara. So Paulo Montero was a really pure defender, and Grinta and this Garra Charrua that he had was amazing. He still holds the record of the red cards in Serie A, actually. He had 16 red cards in Serie A, and the second player had only 12. So it only shows what kind of a player Paulo Montero was. And then my second memory, it was a completely different memory. So Alvaro Recoba. So one of these magicians that Uruguay actually had in their history. So Enzo Francescoli, and then there was Elchino Recoba, a player that I absolutely loved. Sadly, his career didn't really go as expected, but he was an unbelievable talent. So for me, my first two memories, Paulo Montero and Alvaro Recoba.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question because with Alvaro Recoba, did you watch like live back in the day his 6 month loan spell in Venecia or no, Jacek? Did you experience that at all? Because I heard so many great things about that loan spell.
Only way I could watch Serie A back then was to go to my cousin's place, because you needed to pay a lot of money, which I didn't have at this time. So I was mostly monitoring his loan to Venezia in the newspapers. There was a newspaper, there still is a newspaper in Poland called Football, and they were always making these articles on mostly on Serie A, because Serie A back then was the best league in the world. Like all the best players wanted to play in Serie A. So Serie A is what Premier League is now. Yeah, I remember that Recoba was actually really really good for Venezia. But once again, he could have achieved much more than what he did.
And that's the thing. You obviously are passionate about young players coming through, assessing and what they can be, but you always will be a bit disappointed by the players who did not live up to the potential. And obviously, you can never expect or never predict it like accurately for like let's say 70-80%. You probably will be right 10-20% because it's so difficult, because there's so many factors playing into it, which you, as someone who sees as a 70-year-old or 80-year-old 18-year-old, can never predict or never foresee. That's also what makes it interesting, I guess. But with Recoba, it's unfortunate. Yeah.
That's true. We are scouts, not clairvoyants. So we do not have crystal balls and look, yeah, okay, this guy will be a Ballon d'Or winner in 10 years.
Yeah, I would even say South American talents are sometimes the hardest to predict their careers for, because coming through as a young player in South America is so different than in Europe, and that jump can be, especially for these attacking talents, just a crazy hurdle to overcome. So it's very, very difficult to see, just from the potential and just from the performances they have in South America, if they'll actually translate to the European game.
I would say that the success rate of Uruguayan talents is quite high compared to Brazil or Argentina, because let's not fool ourselves. There are no 50 players coming out of Uruguay to Europe every season. There are actually very few. I would like that number to be higher in the future. But yeah, any of these players are really ready to play in Europe in terms of tactics and physicality. That's what I mentioned before. Like there were no many this magical number 10s coming out of Uruguay. These were either strikers or solid midfielders or center backs.
I agree with you that the success rate with Uruguayans probably is higher than when it comes to Brazilians. But also because Uruguayans footballers in general, not all of them, because we've had examples like Sia Pacase, who was at Atletico Madrid, but in general, they come with a real good understanding of what they want to become, what they are, and how they have to be successful. They're not like naive or not, how do you say, I'm looking, not that vain, as some Brazilian footballers, not just, I mean, Brazilian footballers, they produce great players that are really industrious, work hard, and are really diligent, of course. But with Uruguayans, the amount of players that are like saying, "Well, I can do this. I don't have to train that hard. I can rest on my laurels." They're far and few in between. That's because the culture in Uruguay is so competitive and also so grounded. That's one of the big reasons why Uruguay can produce players at quite an impressive rate and be successful, obviously, still on the world stage.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes right into our country contests that we do for all of our nation episodes. And when we look at Uruguay, the thing that immediately jumps out is just what they've achieved with their population. 3.4 million is just a really astounding number when you take into account how long and how successful they've been in football. I mean, for example, only Argentina have won the Copa America on more occasions, and Uruguay are just constantly amongst the sides who are these dark horses at every competition they participate in. I even looked at the FIFA World Rankings. I know it's not always the best metric to gauge the quality of a national team. I remember the years where Belgium was in first place for basically 6 years in a row and never could even make anything work in an international tournament. So don't take them as an absolute guide, but they are interesting at least. And you see there, Uruguay, again, 3.4 million inhabitants, being above the likes of Japan with a population of 124 million, or Mexico with 128 million, and the United States with 335 million. So always this really tiny nation overperforming time and time again. I mean, we mentioned, of course, the mentality in Uruguay, this really grounded and humble attitude that allows them to thrive in European football. But what is maybe the secret behind their success in international football that has allowed them to be such a prestigious nation for so long?
Yeah, I mean, football is such a big, or I wouldn't say a big part, like it's basically the national identity of Uruguay. And it's simply because of the history of Uruguay itself. I mean, a country that fought for independence and had years and years of civil war. Like the population were growing in enormous amounts, a lot of immigrants from Italy and Spain. And with this made Uruguay quite a diverse country, but also a country that it didn't have anything that unified the population. And with the political unrest there as well, which was causing a lot of chaos, Uruguay needed something to really unify the country and the population. And football And this is something that Martin da Cruz in his book From Beauty to Duty really documents well. Football enabled Uruguay to really become a more unified country and also democratize the society, because back then, like many societies, it was a society for the rich mainly, still aristocratic. So that's the starting point. And then what you have with Uruguay is that they were really successful in the early years of football. And as anyone knows, winning creates winning. Winning creates like a more intense culture. You want to emulate it. You want to do it again. And that's the starting point. And that's why football became such a big thing for Uruguay, and it has continued on to be so.
Yeah, I really think the factor you mentioned there regarding the social unrest and also the fact that it was a game for the poor in Uruguay is huge, right? In Uruguay, they had nothing else other than football for so long, and still many today. I mean, we talked a little bit before the show when we think about other reasons to travel as a tourist to Uruguay. There aren't really that many that spring to mind. It's not necessarily this big tourist attraction or hub for foreign investment. So it's really something where football is this unifying factor that brings the people together. And every kid, all their idols from Forlan to all those who preceded him, always looked up to footballers because there was nothing else to look up to.
Oh, I agree completely. And like you said, I mean, that's the thing. When you have, for example, Spain. Spain is an incredibly successful footballing country, certainly in the last 30 years. But Spain obviously is not defined by the fact that they're great at football. It's a country which has many other things going for them if you looked at them, like as a country. But Uruguay, it's not the case, obviously, or less so anyway. Uruguay doesn't have an awful lot they're recognized for, they're known for. I think if you have a survey around world population and you ask what's the first thing you think when you think about Uruguay, perhaps some people will talk about marijuana being legalized or gay marriage or maybe stuff like that. But overall, they will think about football, and that's because this is the first point of identification or recognition with Uruguay. And another thing you mentioned, what young guys idolizing Forlan or players growing up. Every country obviously has that, but what Uruguay has, which I don't think a lot of other countries has, is that kids are brought up on the stories of the past, the winning stories, the successful stories, and it's getting like instilled in their brain in everything they do, and it cultivates this culture of I want to be that, I want to be the next star of Uruguay. So yeah, I think that's a big part.
Let's not forget that Uruguay was the first World Cup champion. This is something that people will never forget. Like people may not remember who was the second, third, fourth, but people will always remember who was the first World Cup winner. And I think it's a fair pride for all Uruguayans to be able to say, yeah, I was the first World Cup winner.
Yeah, and I think the whole topic we're speaking about here relates back to the fact that Uruguay, you just have so much pride and pressure also when you put on that national team jersey because of all those who came before you and because the entire nation is unified around it. I mean, I come from the United States. The entire nation is never unified around our national team. Nobody cares, right? So even though you have 300 plus million people, there is not the same pressure as from the 3 million that live in Uruguay. It's just reality. When the United States plays in Austin, Texas, or Denver, Colorado, there's always more away fans from every Latin American country there than there are United States fans because there isn't that real pride culture integrated into the national team. And I would say in Uruguay, it's amongst the greatest factors in world football. I don't see many nations really being unified behind their national team more than Uruguay in both bad and good times. That comes in the fact of when Uruguay underperforms on the international stage, they're the first ones to hound the team down and really speak their mind. But when the national team performs, then they're also the first ones to cheer them and really put them on a pedestal like heroes.
Yeah, no, good point. And like you mentioned with, for example, the US comparison, but you can also make the China comparison because sometimes I've heard people say, how can a country like China with like 1.5 billion, I think something like that, cannot produce any good football players? And when you hear that for the first time, you think, well, maybe a good point, but actually it's kind of a dumb point because this is a country that doesn't have football as an important part of even their sporting culture, let alone the culture of the country itself. So yeah, then it's possible for Uruguay, a country, and I just looked this up, a country that their population is, I think it doesn't even put them in the top 30 Chinese cities in terms of population. That's why they can outperform China easily. and they've won the China Cup twice, for example. But so yeah, I think it's all about the culture a country has, which then allows a footballing team or the footballing culture to be successful or not. And the US, by the way, I think they're growing for the last few years, but obviously needs a lot of work, because maybe Adam, you can tell me this: where does it rank in terms of the most important sports in the US?
Yeah, exactly. I would say it's probably the fourth biggest sport still in the United States. And those who do play it often come from foreign backgrounds. I mean, I got into football in the United States because my dad was German. So I actually really didn't get into it from my American side, but from my German side. And the same goes for all of the millions of Latin American kids who grew up in the United States. They don't grow up because they're idolizing Landon Donovan. They grow up and play football because they're idolizing Chicharito or their own idols from their home countries. And that goes for basically every single US kid. I mean, obviously it's changing and developing now with, actual players in the US thriving in European football. And the 2026 World Cup will be, a very, very interesting tournament to see where our nation can go with football. But like you say, I mean, you can't even compare it to Uruguay, because what Uruguay has done is cultivated an identity over 100 years. And what the US is trying to do is to accelerate the football identity through success on the field in the here and now. And it's just not that same gradual development that we see in these Latin American countries.
I will put my 3 cents there. I come from Poland, so a country that is over 10 times bigger than Uruguay. And yeah, we can't even compare Poland to Uruguay in terms of success. But it was interesting what you said about the country being unified for the national team. I feel like Poland unified all the time after the defeats, just to mock the national team. So in Uruguay, you see this passion and love and this garra charrua. It's only empty words. It is a thing that exists actually, that passion, love, the determination for the game. So that's why I respect Uruguay so much.
Yeah, David, it's even interesting from your position in the Netherlands versus then also following Uruguayan football, or even in Germany. I mean, often our biggest clubs are those that are traditionally from this Ruhrgebiet. So the individuals who worked in the coal mines all week, and then on the weekends they went to support their football club, like Schalke 04. It's the traditional coal mining club in the rural region of Germany. And you see there, I mean, just the passion and the fascination with football is so much larger there than in other parts of the country where people didn't necessarily have that full tie with their club. And I think that's something which is just so special about Uruguay and so many of these countries of Latin America. There's really people that toil all week long or even months on end, and then they feel unified behind Peñarol, or they feel unified behind the Uruguayan national team. This really gives them meaning in their life. And you see kind of, like I said before, there's so much more pride with wearing the Uruguayan jersey than with wearing even the German national team jersey or the English national team jersey. I mean, here we have players retire from international duty at 29 because they're not necessarily the first choice striker and they want to focus on their club career. Imagine if you did that in Uruguay. I can't even imagine that this could even happen there.
No, I mean, football in South America, not only South America, but certainly South America has a bit of a religious element to it. That's for sure. And that's also because people don't standards of life in terms of what they earn, what kind of opportunities you have, are obviously much lower than when it comes to Western Europe in general. So that's a big part to it, because it's a substitute to many things that I live in the Netherlands can have access to, for example. So that's why football becomes more important, obviously, in many cases. And when it comes to the footballers themselves, it's a way out. I mean, that's what it still is, because of course, I mean, Uruguay, relatively speaking, when you look at South America, it is doing probably the best economically, but that's not saying that much actually when you compare it, for example, to the big economies around. So it's still, if you want to be successful in life, or successful is obviously what is success, but if you want to make money, want to bring up your kids in a better environment than what you've brought up on, being a football player is still probably the best way out if you live in South America.
I think there is a big link between the economical standards and being passionate in football. You can see in Brazil, people are generally, sadly, they're quite poor, but they are the most fanatic. And we see in Eastern Europe this fanatism for football is slowly disappearing. It becomes like theater. People coming to a game during the weekends and then forget about it for the whole working week. And people in South America leaving their club. They're fans not only during the weekends. They are fans, fanatics 24/7.
Yeah, I would even say, I mean, for many people in these regions, football is like a vice. It's like even a healthier version of alcoholism in a sense, right? It's really something that can be almost a way out from the mundane and often terrible conditions of your weekly life. And I think that's something that is really beautiful version of football, especially when we compare it to kind of Western European football where fans have to pay $150 to watch Chelsea versus Ipswich. And they fly over from Asia and go to the Stamford Bridge and take some photos for 90 minutes. I think it's just, yeah, two different realities of the same game. But David, let's move on then a little bit to the domestic football in Uruguay. Obviously, the goal of every Uruguayan town is to make it to Europe as soon as possible. That is, of course, where the money is and where also the best football is. But not to discount also the top flight in Uruguay, the Uruguay Primera Division. What would you say the level is like there?
It's not that great, if I'm honest. I mean, when it comes to Uruguayan leagues, or sorry, South American leagues, it's possibly. I mean, obviously the Brazilian league is first, then you have the Argentinian. These are the two big leagues, and Colombian is quite competitive as well. Ecuadorian, but Uruguay will be behind those four for sure, and probably be in the league with Chile and Paraguay, I think. And my knowledge of actually level in South America is not that great, to be honest. I'm only focused on the national team and the players that can play a part in there, which obviously they do play in South America as well. But that's been a problem in the last 20 years, I would say, because obviously the money is in Europe and also is in Mexico or in Brazil or in Argentina or US. So when, for example, Brian Rodriguez does well for the under 20 side, he's getting picked up by LAFC at 20 years of age. So it's hard then to compete continentally for Uruguayan clubs. So yeah, it's hard. But the positive thing is Peñarol has had a great run in the Copa Libertadores this season. So there are still positive things going on. But in general, when a player is in the Uruguayan league when they're 22 or 23, it's mostly not a good sign because it says to me perhaps they don't have the level to be in a bit better league. Because if they are, they mostly get picked up at 21, 20, 19, 18, 17.
Let's be honest, if you're still in Uruguay by the age of 22, 23, it means that, you probably won't have a top European career. Would also like to mention that even the league in Brazil or Argentina, the level is not as high as many people could think. I watched Brasileirão and I watched Argentinian. Right now, I think it's called Liga Profesional. So the level is not that high. You can find many jewels, you can find many great talents, but like the general level is very behind the top five leagues in Europe.
And another thing that fascinates me about the Uruguayan top flight is the structure. I think we have the similar in Brazil and many South American leagues. This clausura and apertura. When I was researching our Uruguay episode before the show, I basically typed in Uruguayan transfer market. When I go down to leads, there's about 10 different leads listed as the potential top flight. So it's not as simple as when looking for how a Premier League works, for example, in England. Talk to me a little bit about this structure and what's actually important in all of this.
Yeah, no, it's actually quite common in South America itself. I think the Brazilian league and Argentinian league possibly are the only two who don't have it. What that I don't know of, because it's, and I don't actually like it, to be honest. But I think it's done to increase the attractiveness, make it more exciting. Because the thing is, you have the apertura, like in Mexico, for example, 17 games, if I'm not wrong. Then they go into the playoffs, which is obviously exciting for fans. And they do the same in the clausura and they go into the playoffs. To be honest, in Belgium they have a little bit. They have obviously something different, but they also have the post regular season competition. I'm Jacek. I'm not sure what you think about this, but I don't actually like it. But it's the way they've done it, and for many years, yeah, it's interesting for sure. And if you're not used to it, it probably is quite the novel element to it is quite exciting, I guess. Yeah.
I think you need to be South American to fully understand that. While scouting Jeremia Recoba, I was checking his stats, and there was Apertura, Clausura, Torneo Intermedio, playoffs. So it's so complicated. And David, same as you, I'm not the biggest fan. Prefer much more simpler ways to do it. And in my opinion, like the European usual way is the best one.
Yeah, I mean, I have the German background, and I think we really have the simplest and most efficient competitions in Europe. We have one cup, which all the professional clubs play in. There's no second cups or third cups like in England. And we have one league. There's 34 games. You play every team twice, and at the end of it, you have a champion. I think that's kind of the simplest way to do it. But I always enjoy how each league approaches it. With Belgium, where I believe they have the points then when they go into the playoff round, or the MLS, where you can basically win every game and then lose in a playoff. So there's always different interesting ways where different countries approach this problem of crowning a champion. And even though it seems like the easiest way to do it would just be to have a normal league table, people continue to find new and different solutions for doing it. So it's always cool to see how each country approaches it.
My opinion, the stupidest cup was the League Cup. So what is the League Cup? Like you win the league, so you win the cup. But I think in Europe, like in among the top European leagues, it exists only in Portugal nowadays. They have the cup, normal cup, and they have the League Cup. We have it in Poland, but I'm really happy that it doesn't exist anymore in most leagues because let's be honest, teams do not take it really seriously.
Oh no, I think in Portugal you're right. They have the Taga da Liga and Taga da Portugal. So it's interesting, but I don't think managers or players are that happy with it because so many games. Actually, in Uruguay, I think now 3 years there's been a cup competition. Before there was no cup competition. I never understood that either. By the way, why don't you have a cup competition? It's like it's part of your footballing season, right? But it only was like in 2021 or something like this that they were like inaugurating it.
Yeah, it's always funny. I mean, everybody plays the same 90-minute sport, but everything else around it is so different around the world. It's always very, very cool to see that. When we look then at some specific clubs in Uruguay, I think there are two that you always need to mention when speaking about Uruguayan football. The first is Peñarol. They've won the Uruguayan top flight over 50 times. They're the biggest side in Uruguayan football from a historic perspective. And only Independiente and Boca Juniors, so two Argentinian clubs, have won the Copa Libertadores more. They've won the Copa Libertadores 5 times, which is basically the equivalent of the UEFA Champions League in South America, for those who don't know. And they've also won the Club World Cup 3 times. Some will say, well, maybe just a glorified friendly, yet another one of these competitions that can divide opinions, but they have won it 3 times. And then another side from Montevideo, Nacional, are probably the second biggest, or also alongside Peñarol, the biggest side in Uruguay. They've won the Uruguayan top flight 49 times, and they've won the Copa Libertadores and Club World Cup 3 times apiece. And they actually currently lead the Clausura table with a 4-point cushion on Peñarol. So, David, when we talk about Uruguayan football, these are the two clubs you always need to mention. Talk to me a little bit about their rivalry and, in general, their dominance of Uruguayan football.
Yeah, I mean they're like clearly the two big clubs, and I mean the stats you mentioned. I mean that's a point of contention among fans as well. I mean how many league titles they actually won. So we will not get into that, but these are the two big clubs, the giant clubs. There's no competition there. Having said that, in recent years they've been. I mean, if we're talking about in fighting terms, they were wobbling, because they were easily displaced by teams that had no right to actually be in a fight with them, like Montevideo Wanderers, Danubio, Defensor Sporting, these clubs that were able to win Clasuras, or not win maybe, but actually have a fight and be up there. But anyway, these are two big clubs. Then you have still Defensor Sporting, Danubio, Montevideo Wanderers are big clubs. Who actually all of them they produce talent. It's not like it's Peñarol Nacional. That's the good thing as well. I think about Uruguay, because Defensor Sporting has been known for it, but there are many clubs, Boston River, clubs you would have never known of. They produce good talent, and that's the good thing, I think. Yeah.
It's really great that you mentioned that. In my opinion, there is no one club with monopoly for talents. I think talents come from Peñarol, talents come from Nacional. Of course, Danubio, they had the likes of Recoba, Forlan, for example. Osama Gimenez was also from Danubio. So we had, for example, Matias Arezo, one of the biggest talents in Uruguay in recent years. He was coming from River Plate. That only shows that many clubs work good with youth, and many small countries we see this like monopoly. There is one club that rules all the talents. They take all the best talents, but in Uruguay, it's not happening, and it's a really positive thing.
Yeah, it's almost the polar opposite to what we spoke about in our first episode when we spoke about Georgia. I remember Jacek, you asked Mika, what is it like when you guys at Dinamo Tbilisi find a player for another club and think he's really interesting at U14, U15 level? And Mika basically said, yeah, we made one phone call and the player goes to Dinamo Tbilisi because every player wants to go there and all the clubs basically funnel and channel their talent through Dinamo Tbilisi. And that's the complete opposite in Uruguay. I mean, we'll get to the talent production in just a moment here, but when you go through kind of the former academy talents, the national team is populated with players from all over Uruguayan clubs. There's not just basically Peñarol or Nacional dominating the entire development. No, all of these clubs are really doing their part in creating this Uruguayan national team, and it's something really, really special. You're not then reliant on one academy having good processes in place. Even if they fail for a generation, you have these other clubs that can pick up the slack and continue to do so.
There is surely one club that does it better than the others. So, in your opinion, David, what's the biggest talent factory in Uruguay, in your opinion?
I think in recent years, especially when you look at the caliber of players that's coming out of their academy, you can't look past Peñarol at the moment. I mean, just Darwin Núñez and Fede Valverde, just these two names, I mean, arguably the two biggest stars in Uruguayan football currently, or of the national team, the most recognizable names. But I always like Defensor Sporting. I think the depth of talent coming out of there has been very good. Even now, players that have not really broken through on the European scene at all, like Anderson Duarte, for example, they're still high quality talents and still players of 16, 17, 18 right now coming through. And they've always been able to produce. With some clubs, it's like they've got a good spell, some good players, and maybe it takes 5 to 10 years for another like batch of good players coming through. With Defensor Sporting, each 2 years, there are players coming out of there, and they might not always go to Europe, but they have good careers in Argentina or in Mexico or in the US. So in terms of an underrated academy, I would certainly mention Defensor Sporting.
Yeah, it's a fine selection. I mean, you look at some of the key products from the past decades. You have the likes of Diego Godin, an Atletico Madrid legend and longtime captain of the Uruguayan national team. Also, a guy like Martin Cáceres, Diego Lazzalt, Matsi Pereira. So really, these seasoned Uruguayan internationals who've picked up so many caps for the national team. When you compare what Defensor Sporting is in a senior level versus what they are at an academy level, the academy definitely reigns supreme. Also, another interesting one, Danubio FC. David, what do you think about them? Also, maybe a hidden gem of talent development in Uruguay.
Yeah, Danubio is also a good team. With, for example, Sarachi, who's just played a really good game this international break against, or two good games actually, against Colombia and Brazil, coming out of there. But we mentioned earlier that it's the depth of talent coming from various clubs is really good. And thing is as well, sometimes you mentioned Jacek, you mentioned Arezo. That's just a player that everybody raved about, and people who played Football Manager really loved him as well. And unfortunately, for now, it's not worked so far. I mean, at Granada, he wasn't not able to really do anything actually there. He's right now at Gremio. He's not playing a lot, making some cameo appearances. So you never know how things pan out. And he's still like 21, 22, so it can happen. But it's always difficult. But yeah, the talent production is there. What they actually go on to do is always hard to say.
I really like that you mentioned Arezzo. I think Arezzo is one of these Uruguayan strikers that used to watch Luis Suarez every day. Like he really reminds me of Suarez. Of course, not that quality, but it's really sad that he wasn't able to show his potential outside Uruguay because he had two spells in Uruguay actually. So the first one when he came out, then he moved, then he came back. So he was really good in Uruguay, but then abroad it wasn't working at all. And as you mentioned in Gremio, it's not going really well. But I still have hopes for him. I still think he has the potential to become a really decent striker in Europe. And you mentioned Defensor Sporting, and I think we can also mention a player that can be the future of Uruguayan defense, Alan Maturro. I'm really happy that he does so well in Italy these days. He's still only 20 years old, and in my honest opinion, he'll be one of the leaders of the Uruguayan national team if he stays injury free.
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, Matturo, Jacek, I'm sure you've watched the Under-20 World Cup in Argentina. He was an absolute star in that tournament. I mean, he dominated that left flank completely. And under Gilardino, who is now being sacked by Genoa, he's actually gotten some opportunities this season, and he started like the last 4 games. And he still has to grow a lot. Don't get me wrong, but he has got everything to be a really good player and to be a pillar for the Uruguay national team. I mean, if you just look at the options Uruguay have at the back, you could play with Maturro, Bozelli, Facundo Gonzalez, Araujo. You still have Jose Gimenez there. You have Santiago Mourinho at Alaves. So many talents. So that's really exciting for sure. And on Arezo, I agree with you that it can still happen. He's 22 years of age. I mean, some players they are late bloomers. I mean, look at Stuani. Who would have thought that he's the one scoring goals in Europe still, and Cavani and Suarez are back in Argentina and the US respectively. It's it's unbelievable.
That's true. The longevity of Uruguayan players is also incredible, and it also shows their character and their passion for the game.
Yeah, and I think it's as good a time as ever now to maybe move on to that U20 World Cup success in 2023. The tournament was hosted in Argentina, so very, very interesting venue also for Uruguay to achieve such a success. And they did it through, I would say, a very conservative style of play. So they beat Italy in the final after keeping a clean sheet in 6 of their 7 matches. 4 of their victories came via 1-0 scoreline. And when we looked at this success, David, I mean, was it even imaginable going into the tournament? Was this something on people's radar in Uruguay that this was really such a special generation? Or did this really develop as the tournament went on?
I think this ties a little bit back into what we were talking about earlier in terms of the culture. Because Uruguay, every tournament they start, they have the belief to win it. That's how it is. So this was no different. But to be realistic, Uruguay played a good qualifying tournament, the Sudamericano. It's basically the qualifying tournament for the World Cup, for the Under-20 World Cup. But Brazil was just too good for the rest of the field in that tournament. Brazil also beat Uruguay in direct confrontation. So we'll always be hard. But Israel actually beat Brazil. I think it was the quarterfinal. So that opened up the road a little bit. And to Uruguay's performances in the tournament, it was tournament football, basically. They weren't displaying amazing football. They were keeping or staying in games and getting the result with good goals. And Anderson Duarte, who I mentioned earlier, was the big man in the knockout stages. But it was a really exciting tournament. Especially because it was in Argentina. And many Uruguayan fans were able to go to the games to then win it in the final against Italy with Luciano Rodriguez, who had a disappointing tournament, I would say, to then actually score the winning goal and show that I'm Uruguay's golden boy. I'm the next Suarez, which I believe if there's anyone who's going to come close to Suarez of the upcoming generation, it's Luciano Rodriguez. But yeah, it was really exciting, and I'm interested to know, Jacek, Adam, how did you experience the tournament?
Before the tournament, I wasn't seeing Uruguay as one of the main favorites. I think on paper they looked good, but not that good. They actually showed what Uruguayan football is all about. So extreme solidity, consistency. And when you look at this squad today, these players are not considered as top world class talents. So it was a group of really solid players. Plus, as you mentioned, Anderson Duarte doing amazing things. Luciano Rodriguez did his thing in the final. But still, before the tournaments, I wouldn't put my money on Uruguay, to be honest.
Yeah, I would even say it felt like the Euro 2024 Gareth Southgate England with a happier ending then. because they really played the same type of conservative style. And I think Uruguay were also a little bit more vindicated to do so because they didn't necessarily have these absolute standout stars. I mean, you look at England, for example, they had real individual quality where you'd say you don't need to play such a defensive system. Versus in Uruguay, okay, we obviously had some key attacking personnel who we'll get to, but it was more so that they really did this as a unit, as a collective team. And that's quite rare in youth football, I would say. I mean, you looked at Brazil, for example, it was a collection of individuals from the very beginning, and that was ultimately their downfall. Versus Uruguay, were always more than the sum of their parts. And it just goes back to what we mentioned a bit at the beginning of the show. This real pride in the national team. And I would say even the ability to, even in youth national teams where every player's goal is to make a name for themselves and earn that move to Europe, you still didn't feel like people were putting their own ego ahead of the team. And that's ultimately why they were able to succeed where so many other nations with so much more talent, like England, like Brazil, failed in this competition.
Yeah, I certainly agree with the latter part, but I would push back a little bit on the earlier because Uruguay was based on or tried to be based on a solid backbone, a solid defense. And Bozelli and Gonzalez, they were the best center defensive partnership in the tournament, hands down. Maturro great on the left. The right was more interchangeable in terms of who played there and less of a big star. But when you look further up the pitch, yeah, Uruguay played with a defensive midfielder with Damian Garcia or Ignacio Sosa. But next to that was Fabricio Diaz, who was really a really good footballer and who was more focused on progressing the play. And then you had Abaldo, Franco Gonzalez, Luciano Rodriguez, Andres Ferrari, who unfortunately got injured in the first game. But these are all really attacking players. So it was a combination between being solid, but also having enough attacking talent to score goals to make defenders pay. So it was the mix of that, and I think that's the generation that's coming up now. It's a better mix. It's less conservative, as we have seen from Uruguay, for example, in the 2010 World Cup or 2014 World Cup. It's more of a balance, a mix, high intensity, hard working, but also an incredible amount of talent. And that's what is exciting about the national team, the senior national team, which is obviously developing, growing, trying to have a different shape, different identity under Bielsa. We can go on, maybe talk about that. But yeah, that's the exciting thing, I guess, for the future.
And David, would you compare this under 20 team to the team that made the semi-final of the World Cup in 2010? Are there any similarities? I think so. Like extremely solid center back duo, and midfield with hard working players who love to play on high intensity, and then some individual brilliance of the strikers of attacking players. I think there are some similarities between these two teams.
Absolutely, and I honestly get the point which Adam made as well, and I do partly agree with it. And also, this was a team that were able to live in a tournament, to live through hard moments in a game, in games where they were perhaps tested a little bit, and they came out the other side. And that's what I always like about teams. You know, I obviously love teams that can play great football, and that can really blitz their opponents. But what I actually do like a lot more is to see teams suffer, maybe be on the brink of defeat and get out of the other side. That's where you show the character. And when you are young guys who don't play with each other every week, like the under 20 said were, and show that, it's a great testament to their character, and hopefully they can go on to have great careers. Many of them actually, yeah.
Really love that you said like they are able to suffer and still win games. And I think the most Uruguayan club in Europe is Atletico Madrid, and actually they call Atletico sufridores, so the one that suffer. So that's why Cholo Simeone and Atletico in general, they love Uruguayan players so much.
Yeah, if anybody's playing football talent show bingo, you've had your mention of Atletico Madrid and Cholo Simeone. He's come up on every episode, whether we're talking about Georgia, Uruguay, Morocco, or player roles. Cholo Simeone always somehow comes up. So there he is once again.
This time it's not a bias. Like you can't mention Uruguayan football without mentioning Atletico Madrid, and I'm sorry.
No worries, no worries. Yeah, when I looked at Uruguay's campaign, it was really a slow ascent to ultimately then be crowned champions. I mean, obviously, of course, they beat Iraq 4-0 in the opening game, but pretty much everybody could have beat this Iraq side. They were not necessarily the stars of the U20 World Cup. And then they were beaten 3-2 by England, a scoreline which maybe could have even been larger. I mean, England were really by far the superior side in that match. And then in a do or die match against Tunisia, they needed a 90th minute winner to ultimately go through. So it was not really a group stage that by any means looked like a side that would be crowned champions. And then when we get to the knockout stages, that's when we start to slowly see Uruguay come into their trot. You saw a victory over Gambia, 1-0, then a 2-0 versus USA, which I would even maybe argue was their best performance of the entire tournament. A very, very dominant display. Then, of course, we mentioned that 1-0 victory against Israel to go to the final. And then against Italy, who were by far, I would say, the favorites in that final, Uruguay were the better side. I mean, they really nullified an Italian side that had been very, very dominant throughout this tournament. So you really saw how they steadily grew into the side that ultimately won this title by deservedly.
Yeah, no, it was a journey, that tournament. It really was. And good tournaments actually have to be journeys. I mean, it's great to win a tournament like easily, blitz the opposing, all the opponents, but the best tournaments actually are journeys. Argentina was a good example. Lose the first game, grow into it, have the kind of anxiety of not making it to the group stages because they were still struggling against Poland and Mexico to a certain extent. But if you grow into the tournament, get better and win it, it's fantastic. And Uruguay were like that tournament. And the players, I mean, we can talk about the ones we've already mentioned, but I can also talk about the players who are maybe a little bit less known and maybe also because of their own decisions. And I'm talking then about Fabricio Diaz. He's now in Qatar, which is a shame. He's 20, 21 years of age, has been like one of these highly touted young players in Uruguay, debuting when he was 15, being a captain of Liverpool Montevideo during the best period in their recent history. And then he goes to, I think it's Algarava in Qatar. And obviously he makes good money there. And it's a shame that he made a decision, but it also underlines a problem, which is a big problem in Uruguay football, is players not being able to make that move to Europe, not being able to get it. It's not so easy to really dissect that because there are many things contributing to it. One thing contributing to it anyway is the fact that agents have their hands in the pockets a lot. So they have percentages of economic rights, which makes it more difficult for players to sign them because for clubs to sign them because clubs don't want to deal with third parties. They don't want it because it's hard, it's difficult, and certainly when you want to sell a player 2 years on, and the agent gets like 30% of the fee, it's a hassle. That's what's annoying about youth players trying to make it and not being able to make it because agents are ruining it or making bad decisions for them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, just doing the research before the show, I hadn't seen many of these players in over a year now. And you look kind of through their transfer market, you're expecting them to be playing at pretty prestigious clubs now. I mean, they're the winners of the U20 World Cup, which is arguably the biggest youth competition that you can even win. So this should really be the springboard to a top club. I mean, even look at the talents from Mali, where they have gone now from success at the U20 World Cup, and they didn't even make it to the finals. I believe they exited somewhere in the knockout stages, and they've gone now to really, really high-profile clubs, many of them. Versus in this Uruguay squad, you look at a guy like Anderson Duarte. He's a great example. He scored in the round of 16, he scored in the quarterfinals, and he scored in the semifinals. Crucial goals to get Uruguay through this tournament. And now he's playing in Toluca in Mexico. You know, a solid Liga MX side, but also nothing like you would expect really for such a high profile player from a premier youth competition. So it's very, very interesting and also a little bit disheartening to see where these careers have gone so far. I mean, we shouldn't write them off. There's still a long, long road to go, but I think I would have expected a little bit more from their next moves.
I'm happy that you mentioned, David, the agents. So, in my opinion, a big problem in football. So all these shady agents, aka jackals, and also surroundings and advisors for players, it's a huge problem in Africa, in South America, but also in Europe. And when I look at the squads, I think the biggest disappointment is Fabricio Diaz. He was the true leader of this team. He was linked even with Barcelona back then. So it's really disappointing that he made this choice to go to Qatar and practically miss a very important part of his developments. I think even a move like Boselli made to River Plate would be a much better idea for him.
I agree with you because it's infuriating and disheartening. I think, Adam, you used the word disheartening is another good word to use because you see these players play at the highest level on youth level possible and do so well, and they don't earn these moves. And the agent component to it is big. It's absolutely huge. That's one that is, but also Uruguayan footballers aren't that marketable, compared to other countries. That's another thing that's a contributing factor to it. And that I mean, because Diaz he went to Qatar, and it's a bad decision. But it's also true that actually he didn't have a lot of options, which is really an astounding thing to say after you've just captained at the under 20 World Cup level and won it. Boselli, he went to River Plate, which it's a better move, much better move. But I cannot understand for the life of me how a club in Europe cannot pick him up for like 4 or 5 million. This was the best central defender in the tournament. Strong, physical, solid, good on the ground as well. Why don't you sign him? I just don't understand it. And I can keep on with players of that team who should have earned moves. And Luciano Rodriguez, he would have gone to Girona, but eventually now is in Brazil in Bahia, which isn't a bad destination to be in at 21. But why doesn't the Porto or Braga sign him for 10 million? I just don't understand it, but I guess that's just the way it is.
It's very true, and let's be honest, Uruguay with the human potential, so a very small population, you can't really afford losing talents, right? So you don't have the luxury like Brazil. In Brazil there are many flops, and they don't care because they have like 50 other talents going to Europe at these very moments. And for Uruguay, it's a huge loss. So all these decisions are crucial for the careers of these players, but also Uruguayan football as a whole.
That's the thing. Diaz is a player of a level that not many can touch at 20, 21, 19, like he's been able to touch. So when he's going to Qatar, he loses a lot of years of vital development. It's hard to replace it. And another point, I mean, maybe we can talk about him because I know, Jacek, you live in Belgium and you probably are aware of him, Andres Ferrari. He's a player who actually did make a move to Europe, but I even think it was before the Under 20 World Cup. So before the Under 20 World Cup, he already was signed by the Villarreal. Had a tough season last season. Wasn't really able to break through at the Villarreal B side. But now in Belgium, he's had to fight for his place. Actually, any minute or every minute he's been given, he's made the most of it. So, what do you think of him, Jacek?
So as we mentioned, not every talent will peak at 19 and will be great at 19. So I still think the move to VRL wasn't that bad. So you have the opportunity to play for VRL B, which was a great thing for many footballers, such as, for example, Nicolas Jackson, who started at VRL B, then he moved on loan to Mirandes, and right now he's at Chelsea. So I still think Ferrari will mark his name at a quite high level in Europe, although I don't see him reaching the absolute top. He still has a chance to realize himself in a top five league, not necessarily in a top club.
No, I agree. I mean, that's the thing. When you obviously are a young striker coming through in Uruguay, you always have the Suarez, Cavani as something you look up to. But it's okay if you are a player that goes on to have a good career at, like, let's say he moves to Benfica. Just Benfica or Braga, and he has a good career there. Maybe he makes a move to the Spanish league and has a few good years at Real Sociedad, or maybe a little bit lower. That's fine. I mean, not everybody can be a world class striker. So we'll see. He has the profile, I think, to be successful. He's quick. He's got a good physique, decent height, can score goals in many different ways. So he excites me a lot. I think a player that maybe has a higher ceiling is Alvaro Rodriguez, but he also obviously has to play and develop, and then we'll see how that unfolds his career.
Yeah, I can't wait to get into some more of these talents in the second half of our show. But before we move on there, let's give a little bit of a mention to the senior national team as well, because they definitely deserve it as well. We're recording right after the latest international break here in November, and it's been, I would say, another successful international break. They beat Colombia 3-2 in Uruguay, and then also took a 1-1 draw away to Brazil. What have you made so far of the national team, David, under Marcelo Bielsa? And where do you see this side going? Do you think that they can replicate the success of the generation before with the lights of Cavani and Suarez and even Forlan? Or do you think they maybe even have a higher ceiling with some new stars rising?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think Bielsa is someone who divides opinion a lot. This international break was good, but we needed it because the two before that were really terrible. Didn't score a goal, drew 3 times, lost once. But against that position, against we should have done better. So it was terrible, but this was good, back on track. What I would say about Bielsa is that he's obviously done good things since taking over. He really restored Uruguay's pride after a humiliating knockout in the 2022 World Cup. Got wins over Argentina and Brazil, which have been really rare in the last 20 years. So he's done that. And what he's also done is really say goodbye to the old generation, which obviously there was a need to do that. Suarez, Cavani, they're not part of the national team anymore, which is a good thing actually at the moment. What I would say though is that Bielsa makes like decisions, and as a fan, and you are thinking, what are you doing? This doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And sometimes he pulls it off, and it's going well. But more often than not, lately it has not. So he still divides opinion, and he also, I don't know. I back him. I want him to be the manager. I trust in him, but I'm not 100% sold as of right now. And that's also because we just did the Copa America. We went to the semifinals for the first time since 2011, which was a good thing, obviously. But was it a success? No, absolutely not. I wouldn't say so. And also because some decisions were made which I didn't think were good and which were detrimental to the end result of the tournament. So yeah, the jury is still out on Bielsa. But for sure, we have a squad, we have players that can do exceptionally well, that can go far at World Cups, that can challenge for Copa America titles, and we have to do it because for all Cavani and Suarez has done, they were playing under a manager who did not allow Uruguay to reach its full potential after the 2011 and 2010 successes. And that is why this team, this generation can do a lot better. You know why? Because the past generation underperformed massively after 2011. Uruguay did not go to a Copa America semi-final on four occasions with that team. It was embarrassing actually. So yeah, this team can do a lot better.
I believe that Bielsa and Uruguay is an interesting mix. So you have the solidity of Uruguayan players' consistency, and then you have a Loco Bielsa, whose style of play is, of course, we all know Bielsa's style. So a very positive style, and I think it can be an explosive mix to combine these two philosophies, like solidity and the fireworks of Bielsa. So I cannot say that it will be a success. We don't know about it, but surely it makes Uruguay one of the teams to watch in the coming years. I wanted Bielsa to become the coach of Poland, and I said to myself, okay, it won't be a success because Polish football, like our state is very low at the moment. But I said to myself, it would be such a beautiful catastrophe to have Bielsa managing Polish players.
Yeah, I can say for myself, at least, I'd definitely be watching more Polish national team games. I may have even tuned into Poland versus Scotland, which under any other manager other than Marcelo Bielsa, I don't think I would watch in a million years. But David, you mentioned very briefly that, of course, Bielsa has gotten rid of kind of the older generation a bit. You mentioned the lights of Cavani, the lights of Suarez. So how is he really integrating this new generation? And are there also players from the U20 World Cup, for example, who have already begun to feature in the national team, or is it maybe a bit too soon for them?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic because partly he has tried to get them into the squad, and some of them are members, like Luciano Rodriguez. He's been a consistent member, but he's actually not gotten a lot of minutes whatsoever. And actually, what he's done, he's called up players who were once quite big prospects at their respective positions, like Marcelo Saracchi, who we mentioned earlier, or Guillermo Varela, who was at United like in 2016, 2015, who've not been able to really live up to their potential. But actually, they've become members of the national team at the moment. So it's interesting to see. It's not the complete integration of the under 20 team. I think he wants to do it, but he's taking it easily and gradually. And as far as the older generation, thankfully for him, quite a lot of them were already phased out. but Suarez and Cavani were still like members. Suarez, obviously, he played in the Copa America. He had his last game against Paraguay, or was it Paraguay? Yeah, I think it was Paraguay a few months back. And the thing with this team as well is that it's a good mix at the moment, because you have Valverde, Josema, they are already past 25. Josema already almost 30. And these are players who have, Josema has like 92 games for Uruguay at the moment. Valverde, Bentancur, they have 50 plus. So they're already quite experienced. And to have these group of players with Araujo as well and Darwin, and then try to combine them with the players coming through, like Luciano or Maturro, maybe if he can keep going and keep developing, that's the right mix for Bielsa. And I think he's working towards that, but it's not easy, obviously.
Bielsa already has the core, as you mentioned. So Fede Valverde, Darwin, Grinta, even though he's still very young, but he can be considered as one of the core players for Bielsa. So the most important for him will be to adjust all these young players like Luciano. And of course, it depends also on them and on their careers and how they will perform. I still think he has an interesting group of players, and many more will be joining this team in the future. Of course, I think Araujo is a huge miss. I mean, I don't know what's your opinion on Araujo, but this guy is just a monster of a center back. Probably the
Yeah.
best 1v1 defender since Van Dijk. So if he comes back, and if Jose Gimenez actually stays fit for a longer period of time, this will be another amazing center back duo for Uruguay. And as you mentioned, there is Boselli, Facundo Gonzalez, so that core will be even more solid in the future.
On Araujo, that man is like, his physical capabilities are incredible. He's grown so much in terms of his ball playing abilities. And the thing with him as well is he's got the pace and the power to like be incredibly aggressive in terms of the way he defends, but actually he is not. He's quite tactical, quite conservative, like waiting, like Van Dijk, for example. The only thing with him, which is a shame, and it happens in footballing careers, even to the best, is that he had the bad spell with Barcelona last season, where he was at fault for some big errors, especially against Paris Saint-Germain. I think it was the quarterfinal of the Champions League. And these things then stay in the mind of people. But when you look at the last, let's say, 4 years of his career at Barcelona, when they won the league, he was one of the best defenders in world football, and he still is actually for me. When he gets back to his best, he's one of the best around. And I love him. I really love him, and I hope one day he will be the captain of Uruguay. Because if there's anyone who is actually a captain, like in the way he carries himself, in the way he plays football, he is it. He's just captain material. Incredible.
Yeah, I think this factor is so present in center backs specifically. I look at a guy like Dayo Upamecano, for example. He had, I think 2 years ago, a really catastrophic game against Manchester City in the Champions League. And it starts an agenda for people in their minds that, oh yeah, Dayo Upamecano, this completely error-prone center back who is never there on big occasions. And Upamecano now needs to play 14, 15 games in the Champions League, all at a consistently high level before people start changing that agenda again. And it's just so difficult for these players. I mean, Upamecano and Araujo as well, they play in these super high defensive lines. They play so far ahead of their own goal. A guy like Maldini, for example, in the past, or Cannavaro, or even a Sergio Ramos, they never had to defend in this way. Like the requirements for a center back in the modern game are so much harder than what center backs had in the past. And obviously errors and poor games when they come in, they're only human and they're still young players. But you really can't judge these players on one game. The same way that you can't judge a young player when they have a 10 out of 10 performance in a Champions League fixture, you also shouldn't judge them off of one bad decision in a game that leads to a red card.
I fully agree. And another point, I mean, Araujo, I think he's 24 now, maybe 25. Upamecano, I think he's similar. Van Dijk, when he was that age, he was playing in Scotland or in the Netherlands. Don't you think he was making mistakes back then? So the thing is, when you're a young player who actually at 19, 20 are among the best players in your position, or perhaps one of the best young talents, and playing in a big league for a big club, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to be singled out. And Yamal is a great player, but maybe he will have a period in his career. I don't think actually he will, because he's that good. But mostly it happens. Garnacho is a good example right now. Garnacho has had a tough few games lately for United, he's been criticized. And it happens when you're that young and on a big stage. So yeah, and Maldini is a good example. We just mentioned earlier with Recoba at Venezia, you weren't able to watch him week in, week out. You couldn't also see if he was making mistakes week in, week out. For example, when it comes to Maldini, or when it comes to Baresi, or Pele. Didn't you think Pele had a bad game? Of course he had a bad game. Maradona, he's also had bad games, but you don't know about them. And when you can access them, when you can watch every minute of every player, it's easier to criticize and to scrutinize them. And that's what I think is one of the negative side effects of having everything available to us when it comes to football.
People have tendencies to say, yeah, during my times, I remember football was better, players were better. No, in my opinion, football was not better. Maybe it was slightly more interesting in the 90s, but right now football is much better. Like it's more intense, it's faster, it's more demanding. But about Araujo and Jose Gimenez, I think if they are fit, I don't think you would find five better center back duos in world football. I mean, okay, Jose Gimenez is not regarded as one of the best center backs in world football just because of his injuries. He was a monster of a talent. He was growing up alongside Diego Godin, and the only thing that stopped him to become one of the great center backs in world football were injuries actually. And every time I watch Atletico and I see Josema on the ground, I'm shaking. I'm really worried about him because he's so injury prone. As you mentioned, I respect that he has over 90 caps for Uruguay, but imagine without all these injuries, what kind of a legend he could have become for Uruguay and Atleti.
That's the thing with Josema. The amount of times he went down injured, and the fact he actually got 92 caps for Uruguay. You know why that is? Because mostly he's able to be back fit for Uruguay a lot of the time, and possibly to his own detriment. Maybe too early. And when you look at Josema, I remember 2013 qualifier against Colombia. He marked Falcao out of game. Falcao being at the top of his game back then. He was 18 years of age back then. He played against Sturridge and Rooney at the World Cup in 2014 when Sturridge was on fire. Did an incredible job on him. If you have that level of talent, that type of character, and you have no injuries or not a lot, you're talking about someone who is regarded as one of the best defenders in the 21st century. I really believe that. Maybe it seems like a hyperbole, but I actually do believe that. But yeah, if you are injured every, let's say, 3-4 months, it's so hard to actually be able to be on top of your game and also get better. Because how can you get better when you're injured like every 4 or 5 months for the last 6-7 years? And that's just a shame.
Yeah, especially at center back, because I think routine and consistency is so important. And I don't want to always relate this back to the United States, but like we have, for example, Christian Pulisic, who is our star player, right? By far the best player. And the October national team camp, we played against Mexico. So the biggest match for the United States. It was only a Nations League fixture for us, but still a huge fixture. And Christian Pulisic did not travel with the squad because he felt a little bit of a muscular strain and decided to return to Milan to not get injured. Now I relate that back to Jose Gimenez, which is the complete opposite. We're talking about a player who bleeds for the national team, who will go through anything to play for the national team, whether it's a friendly fixture or not. I mean, imagine Gimenez returning to Atleti because he felt a little bit of strain in his muscle before a match against Brazil or Argentina. It's not in the nation's DNA to do that. The fans will never want him to play for the national team again if he decided to do that, I feel like. And I think that goes back to, again, what makes Uruguay special. Players have pride and they feel true passion for the national team, whether it's a friendly or whether it's a World Cup final. It's played in the exact same manner.
I mentioned this Charrua and Grinta are not just empty words. These Uruguayans really feel the passion for football for the national team. I think the number of caps for Jose Gimenez, I remember doing a post a few years ago about 23-year-olds with the most caps for the national teams, and Josema was one of the top three players. So he already had like 40 games at the age of 23, I think. And it's funny, David, that you mentioned Falcao. I remember the anecdote of Radamel Falcao when Colombia was facing Uruguay. Actually, Jose Gimenez was marking Falcao during a corner kick, And you know Falcao, he was a killer. He was a monster in the penalty area. Nothing could distract him. And he mentioned that Jose came to him and asked him, why does the Colombian flag has three colors on it? And Falcao said that he was so incredibly distracted. Like this question was so stupid and ridiculous that then actually he was out for a few seconds. You can say that it was a stupid question, but it was also a really clever one from Josema.
Yeah, I remember that story. Yeah, I remember reading that how he like taunted Falcao all game and actually just breaking his concentration completely. Yeah, well, that was a fun story actually. But yeah, I mean, Josema, he's probably one of the big players of Uruguayan football in the last 20 years, I would say. But also it leaves you like with a little bit of a sour taste, bittersweet taste, because what could have been. Having said that, he's 28, 29, and he is actually this season. Jacek, I'm pretty sure this is the case, but this season he's when it comes to injuries, it's one of his best seasons so far. He's not missed a lot of games. So hopefully he's been able to improve right now and be well more reliable in terms of availability, because it can happen. I mean, Robin, for example, he's had a lot of injuries throughout his career, but later on in his career, I recall that he actually was a little bit more reliable in terms of availability. So maybe this is the case with Josema as well. Would be great.
I tell you, David, this season I watched every single Atletico game, and in some of these games, Josema was purely world class. And yeah, Atletico right now are having all kinds of problems, and if Josema will be out, it will get even worse. So I think the thing that we should respect a lot is that despite all these injuries, Josema Gimenez will end his career as a Uruguayan and Atletico legend without any doubt.
Yeah, an absolute rarity also in modern football, I would say, to be a club and country legend.
David, do you think that Josema Gimenez had more potential, well, had the potential to make a bigger career than Diego Godin? In your honest opinion?
It's a good question. Really good question, because obviously they're always compared. I mean, Godin was kind of the master, and Josema the apprentice. But I actually think he could, because he is quicker, more explosive, more physical, more imposing. So that's I remember him having really good games against Lewandowski, for example, really marking him out of the game because he was quick to everything. And Godin obviously relied more on his tactical knowledge, his know-how, being able to read the game, cut out danger, but not overcommitting himself, because that would be a problem for him. I mean, I remember him being sprinted by Suarez, so outsprinted by Suarez during Atletico Barcelona game, while Suarez was never the quickest, but at that moment he wasn't at all. So Josema had more physical capabilities, I think, than Godin, and I think therefore he probably could have overtaken him in terms of his career achievements. But so far it's not the case, because Godin obviously more longevity, more available in terms of when it comes to injuries. But yeah, it's interesting and quite a bit. It's entertaining to compare how their careers have been and how perhaps Josema could have been better. But it's a hard one, I guess. But if I have to answer, I say yeah, Josema could have become a bigger, a more accomplished player than Godin.
Agree. I honestly agree, even though like Godin is an exemplar player for me. Like he was the leader on the pitch, humble outside the pitch, like a great example for so many defenders or footballers. But I agree that Josema had slightly more potential. He was faster, he was better on the ball. I remember him playing at the youth level, even as a defensive midfielder, thanks to his ball skills. So yeah, it's a real shame that all those injuries came for Josema, because Godin, one of the strengths of Godin was his consistency. He was always there, like he was playing every game, so he was injury free. So a shame, but still Josema is only 29, so he has like at least 5 6 years of playing at a top level, and with being Uruguayan and knowing the longevity of Uruguayan players, maybe even more.
Yeah, I was about to say, I mean, obviously Jose Ma is a little bit more reliant on his physical attributes than Godin, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that Jose Ma has already been at his peak or is currently in his peak. I think we see so many center backs, like Van Dijk is a great example, who compete when they get up to 32, 33, 34. So I don't even think this debate is fully closed yet, and maybe we still see Josema overtake Godin for the peak talent. But that rounds up part one, and in part two, we'll go through some of the rising Uruguayan talents. Okay, welcome back for part two of our Uruguay special. We've laid the groundwork, explored Uruguay's domestic talent production, some of the biggest figures in the national team, and also that U20 World Cup success. And now I think it's interesting to go into some more specific names rising through the Uruguayan system. We've each selected 2 players under the age of 23. One of them has to still be actively playing in Uruguay, but both can be. And Jacek, I'll start with you then. Who have you selected for your first pick?
So for the under 19 talents, I picked Rodrigo Dudok, a player that I enjoyed watching at the youth level for Uruguay, and a player who was playing actually with older players very often. So he's a 2007 generation, and he was already playing with 2006 under 17s of Uruguay. He's, I would say, a prototypical winger product of Uruguay. So left-footed, playing on the left side. It's not something that I really like with Uruguay. I would love to see more inverted wingers, creative wingers. And Rodrigo Dudok is a typical player like, for example, Cebolla Rodriguez. So one of these legendary players of Uruguay in the 21st century. So he's extremely fast, not the tallest, but also very athletic, incredible acceleration, dribbling, and close control. He already made his professional debut in the Primera División, so he's surely among the most talented Uruguayan players at the moment.
With Dudok, he is one who perhaps will be part of the upcoming under 20 side, even though he is that young. And that's obviously testament to his talent. The thing is, the quantity of wingers in the last few years has been increasing. The star players are still the midfielders, defenders, strikers. So the level is not there yet, but I think it's increasing. It's increasing, and we see better players, more talented players. And you were talking about inverted wingers. That's the thing I would like to see as well. Jorge Andrés Queta could play as an inverted winger, obviously. Another one, Brian Ocampo, for Cadiz, he's that type of player. But overall, I agree that it's more like pure wingers currently. But if they are of a certain level, it's obviously great. And hopefully Dudok is one who can reach that level and be a player for the national team.
Yeah, I think the winger position in general has been so interesting at Uruguay because I think, like we mentioned earlier on in the show, it's not necessarily a role that Uruguay has produced the absolute highest level at in the past. And I don't necessarily think it's always because Uruguay aren't producing the talent, and more so that they're just not getting that opportunity in Europe. I think that for some reason, clubs in Spain and Portugal, these traditional roots maybe for Uruguay, they don't feel like they necessarily need to recruit abroad for these players, or they'd rather go to Brazil, for example, to find these players than to go to Uruguay. So I think it's more so a lack of opportunity rather than pure lack of talent production. Or David, I mean, you have a better insight. Am I seeing that wrong?
No, it's a good point. And you also have to remember that Uruguay for a lot of years played 4-4-2 mainly, played without wingers, 2 strikers up top with Cavani and Suarez, obviously. So yeah, it's a hard pathway.
I think 99% of wingers from Uruguay are, as we mentioned in our player roles episode, are explosive wingers, and it's not really a product that European teams look out for these days. So, for example, Facundo Pellistri, in Europe, these players are more like wing backs these days. So, for me, a player like Facundo Pellistri, he's really good at what he does, but is not something that European teams really love these days. And if Pellistri wasn't Uruguayan and he was, for example, Spanish, he would play more like Jesus Navas, so a right back, wing back. Even now in the senior national team, we see Matias Arezo, who's also left-footed, and he's more of a wing back, but he plays on this left wing. So I would like to see if I could complain about something in Uruguay, it's that I would love to see more creativity on the wings and make a not really a revolution but evolution of these wingers. So from these explosive ones basing only on their pace to the more creative ones that South America has so many. And one of the prime examples for me is Angel Di Maria. So I would love to see more Angelitos in Uruguay.
Yeah, for those who listened to our player roles episode, I think we mentioned explosive wingers are a little bit more rudimentary, a little bit more pure vertical exploiting pace versus then an inside forward or even a flamboyant winger are more kind of these technical players who have more to their game, are more goal driven. I think that's something that what Jacek mentioned would really help Uruguayan players adapt to European football also, where it does feel a little bit more result driven and that clubs really want to see a higher goal and assist output from their wingers. David, let's go to your player then.
Yeah, so for my under 19 talent, I had Gonzalo Petit. He's probably one of the biggest or the best under 19 players in Uruguay right now. He's made his debut for Nacional earlier this year. Scored a really good goal in the Clásico against Peñarol. It was a big moment for him, and I hope to see him as part of the under 20 team in 2 months' time. I think it already is 2-3 months' time when the Sudamericano is played. I mean, he's quite tall but technical. He's a goal scorer, but he's also quite inventive as a player. He can make things happen besides scoring goals. So yeah, he's an interesting prospect that doesn't really fit into one or another profile. He's like a bit of he's a hybrid, I would say. So I'm really excited by him. I hope he can have opportunities for Nacional in the upcoming few months, upcoming year or year and a half, and then maybe find himself a move to a club in Europe and hopefully have a good path. Not like Pellistri who goes to United, doesn't play, go out on loan in teams that don't really play to his strengths. And then because of that, he's got 2, 3, or 4 years where he cannot really properly develop as a player. And now he's in Greece. And even in Greece, he's not really a starter. So that's the nightmare scenario. So hopefully Petit doesn't go on the same path, because I really do believe he's a talented player.
David, you took my player. Honestly, for the under 23 option, I have a different player, but I really wanted to mention Gonzalo Petit because I'm a big fan of his talents. If you don't know what kind of a player Gonzalo Petit is, I compared him to Dimitar Berbatov actually a few months ago in my Talent of the Day section. I could also compare him to Nick Woltemades, so a player that you are very familiar with. He's not your typical number nine from Uruguay. So he's not Maxi Gomez, he's not Cavani, he's a much more creative version. So he can also play as a second striker, even as an attacking midfielder. So great link up, great elegance in the ball. I'm a big fan of this guy and really hope to see him much more in the Uruguayan Primera Division in the coming months.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I haven't seen too much of him, but when you say guys like Berbatov and Voltemada, I think of absolute stature, where you think this is going to be yet another target man who's just there for his heading ability, and then he comes out with one of the best first touches and elegance on the ball that you've ever seen. So kind of these players that have a few more tricks up their sleeve than one would imagine on the first sight. And David, I mean, you mentioned also earlier on the show the Copa Uruguay that's just come into fruition a few years ago. And I would argue Gonzalo Petit is maybe the biggest benefactor of this competition, because in 152 minutes, he's already scored 2 goals and 2 assists in the Copa Uruguay. So he's really using those minutes in a cup competition to make notice of himself. And yeah, definitely a talent to watch out for in the near future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, he's been able to be in that cup side, Nacional has been giving more minutes to players in the cup competition, and he's done well. And I think Nacional are playing this weekend as well, or maybe even tonight in the Copa Uruguay, and he's expected to play as well. So that's good. I mean, Ferrari, for example, he was I think top scorer of the Copa Uruguay when Defensa Sporting won it like 2 years ago, and that was also good for him to get minutes and eventually land a move to Europe. So that's good.
Yeah, David, you mentioned he's playing tonight, but I imagine that's more so in the very early hours of the morning. We're obviously recording here in Europe, and following South American football cannot always be the easiest. So, David, we applaud you for even maintaining that kind of Uruguayan football watching while living in Holland. I'll go with my player now, though, Germán Barbas. He's a 2007 talent from Peñarol. And for me, I mean, yes, we speak often about talent, and you often mention how critical I am of players. I never give really the highest scores, but this is really a 10 out of 10 talent for me. And like I said, I really do not give these high talent scores very often, but this is a player who absolutely astounded me when I watched him at the Alcadia tournament in Valencia. He's playing a few years up at the U20 level and just put on a masterclass performance. In the final against Argentina, he comes onto the field very, very early, scores the game-winning goal, and in general throughout the tournament was just a constant focal point. Already, clubs like Real Madrid are heavily monitoring him. The parallels to another Peñarol graduate in Fede Valverde are obviously apparent in his game, but I would even say it's too early to even describe where he will be in the future because he just brings so much to the game. I mean, obviously he has that bots to bots energy and that stature and even the tenacity and duels of a Fede Valverde, but I would say he's even more elegant on the ball than Fede. So he has kind of a really unique turning ability and skillful manipulation ability and technique on the ball, which I could even imagine him turning into like an Alexander Isak in the future. So one of these shadow striker center forwards who can really, really just dribble and carry the ball through passages. So really, like I said, it's too early for me to determine exactly what type of player he is. But whatever he turns into, it'll be an absolute monster profile because he just brings so much to the game.
Oh, he's a big talent. I mean, that tournament, he excelled, and people are really raving about him. And the funny thing about it is when I hear you talk about him, I'm getting excited, obviously, and I'm excited for his future. But in my mind, I had Juan Manuel Boselli, Emiliano Gomez, Rodrigo Amaral. These are 3 players, for example, who are technical players, showed so much promise, and seemed people thought of they will be great players for Uruguay, and it doesn't happen. So you never know, but you can only judge on what you see at this moment in time. And for now, Germán Barbas is a really exciting player, like Dudok perhaps can also be Petit as well, and we will see. We will follow them, and hopefully we will be cheering them on as they have great success in their career.
Well, it's a historical moment, Adam, because it's the first time that you rate a player higher than myself. Obviously, I rate him incredibly high, but not maybe as a 10 out of 10. But the truth is that he's an incredible prospect. For me, he's not a typical Uruguayan product, so he has so much elegance and technique. You mentioned Fede Valverde, and actually Fede Valverde came to Europe as a number 10, as a more of a creative asset, and in Europe he became more of a box-to-box midfielder in Real Madrid. I don't see Herman going that way. I think he will always be an extremely creative guy in the final third. So I see him as an advanced playmaker, but he's such a joy to watch, and definitely a guy I will be monitoring very much in the coming months. And 100% I will make a report on him on FTS within the next 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, it's such a top talent. And I don't want to derail us too much, but I think we do need to speak just a moment on Fede Valverde. We haven't spoken about him for a second, really. For me, an absolute chameleon player. He can do anything you want from him in your side. I speak of him sometimes like almost pouring sand through a glass of stones. So basically, all the little spaces that you need to be filled, Fede Valverde is there. If you have Carval bombing up the field and you need someone to hold in transitions, Fede Valverde will be there. Or if you need someone who can actually create attacking impulses in the final minutes, who can shoot from range, who even has a really underrated creative passing ability, Fede Valverde can do that also. So, I mean, he's arguably playing for the best side in world football, and he's playing every single minute. Yet I still find that he's one of the most underrated players in the world. I mean, every club in world football would benefit from having Fede Valverde in their midfield. He's really the epitome of a modern midfielder.
Yeah, I fully agree. And ironically, his versatility is a strength, but also a weakness. Because you say like he's underrated, but if he was playing week in week out for the last 6 years as Real Madrid's number 8 or maybe Arsenal's number 8, if he was able to play at the club at a certain position and grow in the position rather than playing at right wing back, right wing, right back, holding midfielder, he would have probably been more recognized and also more refined in terms of that particular role. But because he's so versatile and can fill up any hole in the team and help Ancelotti or Zidane out, it's probably one of the reasons why he's more underrated, why he has not as many goals as he probably should have had if he's playing in a certain position week in, week out. But I echo all your thoughts. He's a great player, so well-rounded, and a real modern midfielder.
Versatility can also be a problem. Like for example, Saul Niguez, the problem started when Cholo Simeone started to throw him in every position on the field. But yeah, as I mentioned, Valverde came to Europe as a creative number 10, but he has so many qualities that actually right now I see him more of a box-to-box midfielder. So he's extremely fast, an incredible shot from distance, a great athlete as well, great passing skills. So he's so complete. But it's true what you said, David. His versatility was his enemy. Like he's not regarded as a huge star, but probably for Paolo Ancelotti, he's a true jewel. Like every coach loves these kind of players, and that's true that fans later on they do not really recognize this greatness. But for professionals and for coaches, these players are gold.
Yeah, I think it's one of those where you see the qualities of Fede Valverde more so when he's not on the pitch than when he is on the pitch. Because when he's not on the pitch, you really start to see just how much Real Madrid are missing him and also how much Uruguay will miss him. Let's move on then to our next players here. David, who have you selected then?
So this is not particularly Uruguay's greatest talent in that age bracket, but I think it's always nice to highlight lesser known players who maybe are not on the radar that much, and it's Mathías De Ritis. He's still under contract for Peñarol, but he's actually playing now in Argentina for Banfield. He was part of the under-20 side, the World Cup winning side. Didn't play an awful lot because he's a left back. Maturro was the starting left back. But he's a player who I believe he has good qualities. I'm not saying he's going to be a starting left back for Uruguay in the future. I don't know. Maybe perhaps he can make a squad one day, but I'm not sure. But he's got a really good left foot, good cross on him. He's quite composed in possession. He's aggressive but controlled. He's got the good physical capabilities. He's strong. He's quick enough. He's got a good motor. So he's quite complete. But why I highlighted him here is I wanted to raise another point, is that I would love for Uruguay to have more players like him, but more players in general go to, for example, the second league in England or the second league in Germany. Because these are moves they can make to grow, to play in, week out, and to build a career in Europe. But the problem is that the avenue or the road to these leagues is so hard for Uruguayans because culturally, the German and the English league, or the country for that matter, are like not really compatible. And also, I don't think the scouting of teams in these leagues is that extensive when it comes to South America, or certainly when it comes to Uruguay. And that's the thing I kind of am a bit disappointed by, because I know players like him, or maybe a player like Mateo Ponte, who's now at Botafogo. These players, if they can make the move to, like, for example, Coventry City for like 2 or 3 million, and they land a move there, it will be incredible for their career. And it's not to say that they will become Trent Alexander-Arnolds or Kyle Walkers, but they can have good careers at respectable clubs in big footballing countries. And Matthias De Ritis is a prime example of a player who could walk that road, but unfortunately, because of the problems with agents, with landing moves we've spoken about earlier, it seems like it's just not happening.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting because it's not necessarily like only players from Brazil or Argentina are making these moves. There's also smaller countries in South America who are regularly moving to clubs in France and Belgium and Germany. I mean, I look at Ecuador. It's a great example. Look at a guy like Piero Hincapié, for example, or William Pacho. There's so many examples of players from Ecuador, which again, it's not a huge nation, is not really this prestigious international side where you'd say every football talent scout needs to be there, but they're regularly producing talent that's going to these intermediary leagues in Europe where players are flourishing and then going on to bigger and better things. So I think that's a great example where Uruguay can also take a lot of information from and maybe tailor their practices more to become like a bit like an Ecuador.
With Ecuador, it's slightly easier because they have one club with this big monopoly, so Independiente del Valle. So it's slightly easier. But I really like what David said about this decent careers in Europe. I think with social media today, too many players get disrespected. Like when you say a player plays for Braga and people say, yeah, he's shit, he only plays for Braga. I think people do not realize how incredibly difficult it is these days to become professional, not even reaching the first division in Portugal.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit the phenomenon that there's, I don't know, maybe thousands of professional football clubs in the world, but the majority of the audiences watch the same 20, right? We all watch the same few clubs in the UEFA Champions League, and we forget about the remaining 980 that play in the Belgian first division or play in the Finnish first division. And obviously these aren't necessarily the illustrious careers, but having just a large sample of players make it there is probably even a better gauge of that your talent production is working than having one exceptional player make it to Liverpool. I think that says more about the individual in that regard than necessarily great talent production systems. I'd rather see as kind of my goal to get 10 players playing in Europe rather than have my goal be to have one player playing at the UEFA Champions League level. Jacek, let's move on then to your player.
Okay, so for my under 23 player, I chose Luciano Gonzalez. So the main striker for Uruguay under 17s last year. I think he's another player just like Matias Arezo, who was watching videos of Luis Suarez every day. I even compared him to Luis Suarez in my report, which can sound lazy a bit, and I don't really like doing that, like comparing Brazilian players to Brazilian players. But yeah, Luciano is really a guy who reminds me of Luis Suarez, of El Pistolero, and I heard that he had an injury, a serious injury, recently, so it's a big shame. But I still see him as a great prospect. He's not the tallest, around 180, but he has that killer instinct, great movements, and he also has this Grinta, so great work rates. So a very clever, advanced striker who can, but not necessarily will, follow in the footsteps of the great number nines of Uruguay.
Yeah, I mean his numbers just at youth level are just spectacular. I mean, he had 45 minutes against Germany, scored a brace, 45 minutes against Belgium, scored a goal, 45 minutes against Ecuador, 2 goals, 90 minutes against Uzbekistan, 2 goals. And of course, okay, these are friendlies, but I think at youth level, there's never really that much of a difference between a friendly and a real international fixture. So to have that record against those nations speaks volumes of his goal scoring prowess.
And I think we mentioned two strikers, so Gonzalo Petit and Luciano Gonzalez, and they are two different types of players. And the funny thing is that Gonzalo Petit is 190, and he's not a typical number nine, and Luciano Gonzalez is 180, and he is a typical number nine, so he's a natural born killer. Not the most enjoyable player to watch, but extremely effective and a true king of the penalty area. And one new player that I would like to mention as my special mention would be Damian Garcia. So another extremely solid and consistent defensive midfielder, another vacuum in midfield, just like Manuel Ugarte, a player who played a big role in the Copa Libertadores run for Peñarol. So he's another player that I would expect to come to Europe anytime soon.
I really like the vacuum. I think I'm going to use that more often as a player role, the vacuum. I think that's a cool one. I'll go with my player now. I've gone for a winger, Joaquin Lavega. He plays for River Plate, not that River Plate in Argentina, but the River Plate in Uruguay. And I think he's one of the players who, okay, he's not the absolute youngest anymore. He's born 2005, so he's 19 years old. But he's really profited from just a lot of game time from a very young age. I mean, he's made his debut in 2021 as a 16-year-old, made him the youngest debutant in River Plate's top flight history. And now he's played already 93 matches in the top flight in Uruguay. So just a player who's really learned a lot from a young age, adapted to senior football very early. Obviously, every player wants to move to Europe, but there's also the benefits to just getting a lot of game time at such young years. And in October this year, he was actually called up to the senior national team. So he didn't make his debut against Ecuador and Colombia, but the fact that he's already been integrated into that first team setup from Marcelo Bielsa, again, speaks volumes of a player who will definitely be ready for that move to Europe very, very soon. The first thing that stands out is definitely just his agility and directional changes. I have him as an atomic ant player type. So just these players who are so frustrating to play against, constantly shifting movements, directional changes. They're players who are just so good in tight spaces also. And that really talks a lot about him. Just intricate play, or just dominating down the line with long runs and then putting crosses in for teammates. He brings a lot of that with him. And I would say also the Uruguayan league is not the worst environment for him to grow, because you see from the refereeing decisions that it's not like they necessarily play in his favor. So he's a very diminutive player, but he's not necessarily getting the calls that he maybe would get when he was playing in Spain or other Western European leagues where these players are protected a lot more. You'll see pretty often in matches where a player will go 2-footed in for a challenge that just gets a little inch of the ball and it won't be called as a foul. So I think that's a bit of the hard school that is allowing him to develop. And he does still need to develop. He's very slight physically. He has a very boyish frame that would struggle in kind of more impressive leads. And also, I think his creative passing and general efficiency can still improve. He is, like Jacek said, one of these explosive wingers who has not necessarily made the step yet to become a pure, efficient player that European clubs like so much. So definitely a player to watch, but not necessarily ready yet for the big step to European football. Would need an intermediary league probably to start getting his feet in a higher division.
Exactly. He's yet another of this blend of Uruguayan explosive wingers. I think we could compare him to Rodrigo Dudok, the player that I mentioned earlier. So extremely explosive, great on the ball bravery, but not necessarily a player that European teams will come and watch for weeks and months. So another player that is really good at what he does, but not necessarily a player that European teams, coaches will fall in love with. So once again, as I mentioned, I would love to see more creativity on the wings, and Rodrigo Dudok and Joaquin Lavega, they bring a lot, but they do not necessarily bring what European clubs want these days.
But the thing, Lavega, I like him as a player, but he reminds me a little bit of Pellistri as well in certain regards, and there are many of these types. So it's hard. He has to develop to be a player that can do things in Europe or earn a move and actually succeed in Europe, and that can happen for sure. I mean, he's going to be, I think, the captain of the under-20 side in the Sudamericano, so that's a big thing, obviously. But when it comes to wingers, you need to have the X factor still, and we mentioned Luciano Rodriguez earlier. He's a player. He makes a lot of mistakes still. His basics aren't that great actually, but he's got the X factor. He can win games out of nothing. He's not afraid to make mistakes. He goes again, and you need that like almost big-headedness with wingers or with players to keep doing it again, make mistakes, get better in the process.
Yeah, I would say kind of the best example of what La Vega can develop into is almost a Mohamed Amora. You can clip out probably 5 to 20 minutes of every game of Amora where it looks like a complete disaster, where he's making wrong decisions left and right. But then, like David said, he has that X factor to also keep going and going and going again until he finally gets it right and makes the right decision at the right moment to get an assist or get a goal, get those actions that ultimately matter and decide games.
And I'm really glad that David mentioned Facundo Pellistri. So another really prototypical winger from Uruguay. I'm still shocked that the scouting network of Manchester United sat down and in the space of 2 years decided that signing Daniel James and Facundo Pellistri is a good idea. And I'm still unable to understand that. And as for Pellistri, he was supposed to go to Europe. He had the potential to be a really good explosive winger, but not United, but maybe a team like Celta Vigo as his first move to Europe. And I think it's really important because we mentioned Uruguayan players making bad choices, and for example, Fabricio Diaz going to Qatar, but also like Facundo Pellistri going to United wasn't the best choice for his career.
No, I agree, and I question to you guys. I mean, obviously, players have a certain potential, certain level, but I actually believe, and I would like to hear about what you think about this. Is that obviously a move of a player's career determines whether, or it makes a lot of difference. But I actually, like for example, Pellistri or Joaquin Ardais is another one, or Shia Pacase. If you make the right steps in your career, I think they would have been fine. For example, I think Pellistri would have been better right now as a player if he would have made the right steps. For example, if he would have left Peñarol to go to AZ Alkmaar, a club like that, and he was able to play there, develop, and maybe then move to Braga. And maybe that is his ceiling, maybe that's his ceiling, that's fine. But he would have been a better player, more complete, more momentum in his career than what currently is the case.
I think it's almost good to have a Uruguayan here as an example, and I like what Rodrigo Zalazar did. He's a really, really good example of a player who made a lot of right choices. So I think he goes to Frankfurt. It's way too high of a level, so he lets himself get loaned out immediately. He goes to St. Pauli. Then he gets loaned out again to a maybe more prominent club, but still second Bundesliga in Schalke. And then he goes up with Schalke to the Bundesliga. So then he doesn't try and immediately take that big next step, but takes the gradual step, going to a relegation fighter in the Bundesliga, and then plays a really, really excellent season, has a lot of interest, and then goes to Braga. So a club playing Champions League football, but still, a very quiet environment, not the most demanding club where if you play 2 poor games, you're immediately going to be out of the side. And again, Zalazar is never going to be good enough to play routinely Champions League level football. He's just not the quality to do so, but he's taking the right steps. He's taking gradual steps forward. And it's just a good example of taking those incremental movements to the top where eventually you'll actually get to the level where you hope to be.
Salazar is a great example. One thing I would disagree with, though, is I think he's growing into the level of a Champions League footballer. Absolutely. He actually was in Poland. Jacek, you will know that. He was in Poland for like 6 months. And he didn't do great back then, by the way. And I actually remember him on his birthday going to Auschwitz. I think he was making and having a picture. That's like celebrating. And it was a big problem there, obviously. But he went to São Paulo, good season. Schalke picked him up, great season. The season in Bundesliga, a lot of injuries as well, but still did well. Then go to Braga. First season, did really well. Now he's a star there. At the start of the season, he scored a lot of goals, gave a lot of assists, and he's growing. And I actually believe, maybe I'm wrong, that he could become a player that plays in the Champions League regularly because Braga is not his ceiling. He can make another step. And I don't think he will make a step beyond that. I don't think he will play for Madrid or City, but he can certainly make a step, for example, to... Let's have an example, to Villarreal. I believe that. I believe he can do that. And then you're playing Champions League football. You can. Okay, obviously they are not playing every week. But for example, he could easily play for Ajax or PSV. And PSV is playing Champions League football every season now. So yeah, but it's a good example and a player who actually made the right decisions and hopefully he did it himself. But perhaps he had people or his agency that helped him. And that's the thing with Pellistri. He had the agency that didn't help him whatsoever, and that's just really frustrating to see as a fan.
Yeah, I would say he made the right decisions on a football perspective, but maybe his personal choices weren't always so right. But I hope he's learned from those as well.
As for career choices, I think it's extremely important and it can be as destructive as injuries in football, in my opinion. For example, but I do not blame Pellistri, for example. He was a young player and then Manchester United came and he just couldn't say no. It just his agents and his surroundings and his advisors weren't doing a good job. So it's not the fault of a player, and I always repeat that the surroundings, agents, and advisors are really important in football, and many players lack that.
Yeah, I don't want to leave everyone on a negative note. So, David, it was an absolute pleasure to have you on. I can say for myself, I learned so much about Uruguayan football. I did my research ahead of time, but even I felt unprepared for all the topics we went into today. So it was really, really enlightening. David, if people want to hear more about the Uruguayan national team, where should they follow you?
Well, you can follow me on X or Twitter at Uruguayan Heroes. That's where I'm active. Sometimes I'm on YouTube, but not regularly. And yeah, I appreciate being here. Really enjoyed the chat. Always great to talk about football and Uruguayan football, especially. Yeah, so I appreciate that.
David, it was an absolute joy. I respect your work and dedication so much, especially since you are not Uruguayan, but you are probably one of the most passionate Uruguayan fans, and you are probably one of the most consistent and passionate guys on X I feel that you have been on this platform forever and doing a great job. So please continue, and thank you so much for today.
Well, thanks, Jacek. And the feeling is mutual. I really respect your account and your work. I always love to see it. Certainly when you post about the Uruguayan talent, some of them who I'm not aware of, and and you break it to me. So no, I really appreciate that. And yeah, let's do it again. I mean, maybe about another topic, but Uruguay probably is the best idea to do again. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a Lithuanian on to do an episode on Barca, and now a Dutchman on to do an episode about Uruguay. So it truly shows that football is a global game. And we'll see you guys all again next Thursday for another exciting club episode.